At my son's wedding, I sat quietly proud and tired but happy I had given him this day. $35,000 from my own savings to make every chandelier sparkle, every glass brim with champagne. Then, before 200 guests, he took the microphone and laughed at me, calling my dream a late-life fantasy. The laughter was loud, cruel, and for a moment, I wished I could disappear. But what no one in that room knew was that I was the reason any of them were even celebrating. And when the truth finally came out, the room turned silent. Newport in the summer has a way of dazzling you, almost blinding with its beauty. The ocean stretched endlessly blue against the horizon, and the air carried that faint mix of salt and blooming hydrangeas from the seaside gardens. I remember stepping onto the stone terrace of the resort chandeliers, glittering overhead in the grand hall. Voices rose like music, laughter spilling from every corner, the clinking of champagne glasses blending with the string quartet tucked near the stage. I chose to sit toward the back at a round table decorated with ivory roses and crystal vases, careful not to take the spotlight from my daughter. I had dressed deliberately in a navy dress, simple lines, and the same pearl necklace I had worn for decades. My hands brushed over the pearls as though touching old friends who had seen me through better and worse. I wore flats instead of heels, understated, because this was Lauren's day, not mine. She was 34, and radiant, stepping into a chapter of her life I had once hoped would be smoother than mine had been. From my seat, I watched her glide across the room, her white gown flowing like water, the veil catching the chandelier light and scattering it like tiny stars. People gasped softly, some leaned forward for a better look, and I couldn't help but feel that familiar rush of pride, the kind that swells in your chest until it almost hurts. That was my daughter. My little girl, who once clutched a teddy bear bigger than herself, was now walking like she owned the room. For a moment, just a heartbeat, I let myself believe she might look over and catch my eye share in the joy, maybe even wink as if to say, "We did it, Mom." But instead, she looked past me. Her eyes skimmed the tables, bright with excitement, stopping to wave at college friends and Michael's colleagues. She leaned toward them, her smile wide, introducing herself with the kind of confidence that filled the air like perfume. When she did glance in my direction, it wasn't the kind of look a mother dreams of receiving on her daughter's wedding day. There was no warmth, no shared pride. Her gaze was cool, almost calculated, as if making sure I was exactly where she wanted me, tucked away, unremarkable, dressed plainly enough not to draw a whisper. "Doesn't she look incredible?" one of the women at my table whispered to her husband. And I smiled politely, nodding in agreement. Of course she did. Lauren had always been beautiful, the kind of beauty that made people pause in grocery store aisles or turn heads at airports. But there was a distance now, a wall she had built between us, and I felt it more keenly in that moment than ever before. The laughter around me swelled. Champagne poured servers weaving in and out with trays of lobster rolls and miniature crab cakes. And still I sat quietly, hands folded in my lap, watching my daughter shine without me. A young man leaned over to the woman beside him and said, "This is one of the nicest weddings I've ever been to." She agreed, glancing around, then asked, "Who paid for all this?" The young man shrugged. I pressed my lips together, fighting the urge to answer. $35,000 had left my account in the past year to make this day possible. It wasn't my story to tell, not now, not here. So I stayed silent, tracing the rim of my water glass, letting their assumptions float unchecked. The string quartet shifted into a new piece. Guests rose to toast, the energy lifted higher. But I couldn't shake the feeling of sitting apart, alone in a crowd, invisible in plain sight. I caught sight of Lauren again, laughing with Michael's co-workers, gesturing animatedly. The train of her gown gathered in one hand. She leaned in close to a colleague, pointing discreetly toward me. They both laughed. My heart sank, though I forced a smile when a server refilled my glass. "Margaret, you look lovely," Clara, my older sister, said as she passed my table on her way to another group. "Lovely." It sounded like a word you used for someone who didn't quite fit, but had tried. I thanked her, but her eyes were already drifting to the people she wanted to impress. The chandeliers glowed brighter as the sun slipped lower beyond the tall windows, and the golden light of evening mixed with crystal sparkle. I shifted slightly in my chair, straightened my shoulders, and tried to focus on the joy in the room. But then it happened. Lauren walked up to a group of her friends from New York, and as she introduced herself, her eyes flicked briefly to me. Instead of pride or warmth, I saw something else. Detachment, almost impatience, as though she were silently reminding me of my place. My chest tightened. For the first time that day, my smile faltered, and I looked down at the pearls resting against my collarbone, wishing they could tell me how to bridge a distance that seemed to grow wider with every passing moment. Back in 2016, my world collapsed in ways I never thought possible. After 3 decades of showing up before dawn, staying late, and running an office with the precision of a clockmaker, I was called into a sterile conference room with frosted glass walls. The HR manager avoided my eyes when she said the words restructuring and new direction. What it really meant was that my 60-hour weeks and 30 years of loyalty were worth less than the salary of someone half my age. A young woman in her late 20s slid into my role within weeks. She was fresh-faced, quick with jargon, and cheaper. I left the building carrying a cardboard box that held my framed family photos, a mug Lauren had painted in grade school, and the hollow ache of being discarded. At home, the silence was deafening. I tried to call Daniel, my ex-husband, thinking maybe he would at least understand the humiliation. Instead, his voicemail chirped back at me, and when he finally did return the call, it was from Florida. He told me he had remarried. A woman 12 years younger than him with long blonde hair and a laugh that made him feel alive again. He didn't say it outright, but I heard the implication in his tone. I had become old, replaceable, past my prime. Even our daughter Lauren called less after that. Conversations with her became clipped updates about her job in New York. Always in a rush, her voice tinged with impatience. Lauren was thriving, at least on paper. She was ambitious, relentless, carving out a career in marketing at a Manhattan firm. She wore her success like armor, and when we spoke, she often reminded me that I didn't get her world. To her, I was the outdated model of a mother from another era, someone who never quite understood the language of digital campaigns and branding strategies. Once during lunch at a cafe near her office, I mentioned an idea about improving client communication. She barely looked up from her phone before saying, "Mom, things don't work like that anymore. You should just enjoy retirement or something." Retirement. As though losing my job had been a choice, as though I had stepped aside willingly instead of being shoved out. Michael, her fiancé at the time, wasn't any better. At family dinners, he had a way of leaning back in his chair, explaining things to me like I was a child. "Have you considered doing part-time volunteer work?" he once asked, swirling his wine. "Sometimes it's better to stay engaged rather than trying to compete with people half your age." He meant it kindly, I suppose, but the condescension dripped from every syllable. He was a software engineer at Sterling Systems, full of tech lingo and overconfidence, and he seemed to enjoy reminding me that I had no place in his world. Even Clara, my older sister, joined the chorus of dismissal. She'd call from her cozy home in Connecticut, where she tended her garden and posted pictures of peonies on Facebook. "Margaret," she'd sigh, "you've worked hard enough. Stop trying to prove something." "Plant roses, travel, take up knitting. This business idea of yours, it's just a phase." She said it like she was indulging a child who insisted on wearing a costume to school, knowing the teacher would send her home to change. I tried not to let their voices drown me, but alone at night in my small apartment in Boston, I felt like the walls were pressing in. My phone stayed silent except for marketing emails and the occasional reminder from the landlord. The air was heavy with the weight of what I had lost. I was no longer a wife, no longer an office manager, no longer the center of anyone's life. Even Lauren, my only child, kept me at arm's length. When she did visit, she spent more time scrolling through her phone than looking at me. She'd talk about rooftop bars in Brooklyn, her promotions, her friends jetting off to Europe, and I'd nod, trying to insert a word here or there, only to be brushed aside. One afternoon, I overheard her telling Michael on the phone, "I just wish Mom would accept her age. It's embarrassing when she talks about trying to start something new." My chest tightened hearing that. Embarrassing. That's what I had become to my daughter. A source of discomfort, someone she had to explain away. The memory of that word stayed with me. It echoed when I went grocery shopping, when I tried to strike up a conversation with neighbors, when I scrolled job postings that never led anywhere. It echoed when I stared at my own reflection, the lines around my mouth deeper than I remembered, the streaks of gray more prominent. They saw me as someone finished, irrelevant, obsolete. The worst part wasn't just the world shutting its doors to me. It was realizing that the people closest to me, the ones I had sacrificed for, believed I had nothing left to give. Daniel with his new wife Clara, with her gentle scolding, Michael with his smirks, and Lauren, my Lauren, who once reached for my hand when she was scared of thunderstorms, now rolling her eyes at me like I was a burden she hadn't signed up for. That winter, I sat alone by the window of my apartment watching snow gather on the sill and whispered to myself the truth I had been avoiding. They see me as a leftover. Even in my own family, I am the extra place setting no one needs. The words felt heavy, but speaking them out loud made them undeniable. I pressed my palms against the cold glass and let the thought settle in my bones. It was the first time I admitted to myself just how invisible I had become. In 2017, I sat at my kitchen table with a bank statement spread out in front of me, the numbers stark against the white paper. My entire savings, the sum of decades of work, looked pitiful compared to the new mortgage rates in Boston, compared to the price of health care, compared to the life Lauren seemed to think I should already be living. I stared at those numbers and thought, this is it. Either I let it dwindle away quietly, or I take a chance on myself for once. My fingers trembled as I signed the documents that would establish Hayes Consulting Group, nothing more than a name on paper, and a few hopes stacked neatly in a manila folder. At first it was humiliating how small it all looked. My office was my dining table. My first contracts were with neighborhood businesses, an independent bookstore drowning in mismanaged inventory, a small dental clinic losing track of patient billing. I knew how to make things run, how to tighten processes, how to find money where others thought it had vanished. Those early days were filled with long nights, coffee gone cold, and the quiet doubt that gnawed at me. Maybe Clara was right, maybe Lauren was right, maybe I was chasing ghosts. But the results came. Slowly, then faster. The bookstore went from near bankruptcy to thriving with online orders. The dental clinic saw profits rise within 6 months. Word spread. Owners began to mention my name to one another over Chamber of Commerce lunches. Hayes Consulting Group sounded bigger than it sounded like a firm with an entire team. I hid behind that name intentionally. If people knew it was just me, an older woman working out of a small Boston apartment, they would have laughed me out of the room. One afternoon in 2018, I met Evelyn Carter for coffee in Cambridge. She had been my roommate in college now, a seasoned corporate attorney with her own firm. She looked at me across the table, tapping her pen against her notebook. "Margaret, you're on to something. But don't you dare put your own name on those contracts." I frowned, stung. "Why not?" "It's my work," she leaned in, lowering her voice. "Because the second they see Margaret Hayes, 61 years old, out of work for 2 years, they'll write you off. Hayes Consulting Group. Though, that sounds like an entity, a machine. Keep them guessing and they'll respect you." I hated that she was right, hated that my age and gender meant I had to wear a mask to be taken seriously. But I listened. Between 2018 and 2022, the mask grew into something real. I reinvested every penny I earned, partnered with Evelyn to draft acquisition contracts, and began targeting mid-size firms. One by one, I bought companies that were struggling but salvageable: a data analytics startup in Worcester, a small software development shop in Providence, a logistics consulting firm in Hartford. 7 acquisitions in total spread across New England. By the end of 2022, Hayes Consulting Group wasn't just a name. It was a portfolio worth $55 million with 420 employees who thought they worked for a faceless firm, never knowing their CEO still balanced her own checkbook at night in a modest apartment. I kept it all from Lauren. When she called, she wanted to talk about her campaigns, her clients, her boss in Manhattan who saw her potential. If I mentioned a contract or an acquisition, she'd sigh into the phone. "Mom, that's cute. But honestly, don't you think you're too old to be chasing this?" The words "too old" became a refrain like background noise to our conversations. I stopped sharing not because I had nothing to say, but because I was tired of seeing the dismissive curve of her smile. The biggest acquisition came in the fall of 2022. Sterling Systems. The very company where Michael worked was struggling under mismanagement and debt. It was Evelyn who first brought it to me. "This is big," she said, sliding a folder across my desk, her eyes sharp with excitement. "Sterling Systems has valuable assets, but they're bleeding cash. With the right restructuring, it could double in value within 2 years." I opened the folder, scanning numbers that made my pulse quicken. It was risky, far beyond the size of my previous deals, but I could see the bones of it. The structure was sound, the product viable, only leadership had failed. When the contract was finally signed, my hand shook as I pressed the pen to paper. Sterling Systems was mine. Or rather, it was Hayes Consulting Group's. Michael had no idea, of course. At Thanksgiving that year, he had leaned across the table explaining blockchain to me, as if I were a child, while I sat there biting my tongue thinking, "You don't even realize you now work for me." I wanted to tell Lauren to see pride flicker across her face the way it used to when she brought home a gold star from school. But I knew better. If I told her, she would roll her eyes, accuse me of exaggerating, dismiss my success as a fantasy. So I swallowed the truth and smiled, passing her the cranberry sauce, listening as she complained about her deadlines in Manhattan. The secret sat in my chest like a living thing, burning and alive, but safer kept hidden. By the time the year closed out, Hayes Consulting Group was more than a firm. It was proof. Proof that I wasn't a leftover. Proof that the world had been wrong to discard me. And yet the people whose opinions mattered most, my own family, still saw me as nothing more than a woman past her expiration date. I kept the truth tucked away, knowing it would come out eventually. I just never imagined it would happen in the most public, merciless way possible. Lauren had set her heart on Newport the moment she got engaged. She said nothing else would do, not Boston, not Cape Cod, not even the Berkshires where she'd grown up hiking with me in the summers. It had to be Newport. The historic mansions, the manicured lawns, the ocean views that could make even the plainest wedding look like a spread from a magazine. I knew what that meant: expense. The kind of expense that makes your stomach tighten when you look at numbers on a check. Still, when she sent me the links to the venue and the estimates for catering, florals, and the string quartet, I wrote the checks quietly. $35,000 in the span of months. I wired deposits, signed contracts, and transferred balances. I didn't tell anyone that it wasn't from Daniel's alimony or some dusty settlement. It was from Hayes Consulting Group. From me. When the whispers started, I caught them, though I pretended I didn't. Michael's mother bragging at a bridal shower that Daniel had stepped up to give his daughter a proper wedding. Lauren nodding politely when a family friend assumed the money came from her father. At one dinner, I heard her say, "Yes, Dad helped." Of course. My fork paused halfway to my mouth. It was easier for her to credit him than to admit her mother had quietly shouldered the cost. I swallowed not the food, but the bitterness. The rehearsal dinner was held in a private room at a restaurant overlooking the marina. Candlelight flickered against the walls, and servers poured wine as guests leaned close, laughing over old stories. I wore a soft gray dress and kept my pearls tucked away this time. Lauren looked stunning in a white cocktail dress, Michael beaming beside her, his hand always resting on her back, as though he owned the air around her. Halfway through the evening, as people shifted to coffee and desserts, Lauren found her way to my chair. She bent low, her perfume strong, her smile sweet but tight. "Mom," she said softly enough that only I could hear, "please, don't talk about your company tomorrow." I blinked. "What do you mean?" She brushed a strand of hair from her face and sighed as though explaining something simple to a stubborn child. "Michael's colleagues will be there. His boss, his entire team. They're serious people. They don't need to hear about your projects. I don't want you to embarrass me." Her words landed like stones. Projects. As if 7 acquisitions and hundreds of employees were nothing but crafts I did in my spare time. I felt the heat rise in my chest. "Lauren," I whispered back, "it's not a hobby." She gave me a look sharp enough to cut. "Please, for me. Just say you're between jobs if anyone asks." I could feel Evelyn watching me from across the table, eyebrows drawn, sensing something was off. But I smiled, forcing my lips into a calm line, and nodded. "All right." Lauren's smile brightened instantly. "Thank you, Mom. It's my big day. I just want everything perfect." She kissed my cheek, leaving a trace of lipstick behind, and walked away. Her laughter already blending back into the hum of the room. I sat there, my hands folded, the dessert untouched in front of me. Daniel was across the room holding court with his new wife, her glittering dress catching every candle flame. Guests leaned toward them, laughing at his jokes, praising his generosity. Clara sipped wine, leaning into the story, adding her agreement. I felt like a ghost. Later, as I stepped out onto the terrace for air, the night cool against my skin, I let the truth hit me square in the chest. They wanted my money, yes. They wanted my presence, yes. But they didn't want me. Not the woman I had fought to become, not the business I had built from ashes. They wanted me quiet, smiling, a placeholder, a wallet, and a face in the crowd. I looked out over the dark water, the reflections of yachts bobbing against the docks, and tightened my arms around myself. Somewhere inside, a small voice reminded me that I had chosen silence before, that I had kept my name off contracts, let Hayes Consulting Group take the credit so my age and gender wouldn't betray me. Maybe that had made sense in business, but with my own daughter, it was something else entirely. I went back inside, the warmth and laughter washing over me like a wave I couldn't quite swim in. Lauren was across the room, head thrown back, laughing with her bridesmaids. For a moment she glanced my way. Just to flicker a check to see if I was where she wanted me, sitting down, smiling faintly, saying nothing. That was the moment it hit me with full clarity. I was expected to be silent and to pay. Nothing more. The lights dimmed just enough to signal the start of the speeches, and the chatter around the tables softened. A server collected half-finished glasses of wine. The string quartet's notes faded into silence, and then Amy Wallace rose from her chair. She looked every bit the polished New Yorker. Sleek black dress, sharp heels, her hair pulled into a bun that screamed confidence. She held the microphone with a practiced hand, smiling wide at Lauren, who clutched Michael's arm at the head table. Amy started sweetly, her voice carrying easily across the room. "I met Lauren our first week at NYU, and I knew immediately she was someone extraordinary. She had drive, ambition, and a heart big enough to carry all of us through finals." Guests smiled, nodding along, murmurs of approval weaving through the crowd. Lauren beamed, eyes glistening, leaning closer to Michael. Amy paused for effect, then grinned mischievously. "But you know, no wedding speech is complete without mentioning family." She turned toward my table, her smile too sharp now. Especially the bride's mom. The most interesting character in the room. A few people chuckled politely, but my stomach tightened. I could feel the heat crawling up my neck. Amy's voice took on a playful tone. "Margaret is going through what we like to call a late-life crisis." She made little air quotes with her fingers, earning a wave of laughter. "Some people buy a convertible, others take up yoga. But our Margaret, she decided she's going to build an empire." The word empire landed heavy, coated in sarcasm. The room broke into laughter. Some guests slapped the tables. Others leaned toward each other, smirking. My cheeks burned. I forced a smile, but inside my chest twisted painfully. Amy went on milking the moment. At 61, she's reinventing herself as some kind of CEO. Can you imagine, while the rest of us are trying to figure out how to keep up with 20-somethings on TikTok, she's out here conquering the corporate world. More laughter rolled across the room like a tide. I glanced toward Lauren, praying she'd shift uncomfortably, wave her hand, tell Amy to cut it out. Instead, she laughed. Not politely, not nervously. She threw her head back, her shoulders shaking as if Amy had just delivered the punchline of the night. The sound of my daughter's laughter sliced through me sharper than anything Amy could have said. I pressed my palms against my lap nails, digging into the fabric of my dress. The pearls at my neck suddenly felt like a choke chain. Amy wasn't finished. But don't worry, we love her anyway. It's inspiring, really. Shows that dreams don't have an expiration date, even if, well, some should. Another burst of laughter. Glasses clinked. People leaned back in their chairs, enjoying the show at my expense. I kept smiling, my lips trembling just enough that I prayed no one noticed. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear the rest of Amy's words. My eyes darted across the room trying to anchor myself on something steady. I caught Evelyn's gaze near the back. Her brows were furrowed lips, pressed tight, her expression screaming what I already knew: this wasn't playful. This was cruelty dressed up as comedy. When the applause came, it was loud, enthusiastic, as if Amy had just delivered a perfect toast. She handed the microphone back to the DJ and slid into her seat triumphant. The laughter still buzzed around the table's snippets of voices. So funny, what a character, stabbing me with every syllable. I turned my head slightly, hoping to catch Lauren's eye again, hoping for a flicker of regret, some small gesture that told me she hadn't meant to let her friend cut me open like that. But all I saw was her smile, wide and unbothered, her hand brushing Michael's arm as if nothing unusual had happened. The knot in my chest tightened until I thought I might not be able to breathe. I sipped from my water glass, the cool liquid barely steadying my trembling hands. The clinking, the laughter, the soft music starting up again. It all blurred background noise against the single truth ringing in my ears: my daughter had sat there watching me be mocked, and she had laughed. Lauren rose gracefully, her gown catching the glow of the chandeliers as she took the microphone from Amy. The room quieted. Expectant glasses lifted halfway to lips. She glanced down at her notes, then up at the sea of faces, her smile wide and confident. I want to thank Amy for that wonderful speech, she began, pausing, as people chuckled, still riding the wave of humor at my expense. But I think I should add something about my mom. My breath hitched. For one fleeting second, I hoped she would balance it, soften the sting of Amy's words with something kind. Instead, she tilted her head toward me, her voice laced with a syrupy sweetness that cut sharper than steel. My mom thinks she's a CEO, she said, letting the words linger. But some dreams come with an expiration date. Once you're past 60, you should be realistic about what you can accomplish. The crowd erupted. Laughter, loud and unrestrained, filled every corner of the room. Forks clinked against plates. People leaned toward each other, whispering, nodding, smiling. I sat frozen, a faint smile plastered to my face, as if that mask could keep me from falling apart. I heard someone at the table behind me murmur, "Well, at least she's keeping busy," and another laugh followed. My eyes darted to Michael. He leaned toward a colleague, grinning. His voice pitched low, but clear enough to cut through. Adorable, isn't it? My mom tried a little side gig once, too. Kept her entertained. The men around him chuckled in solidarity. The words sliced straight through me. Side gig, adorable, expiration date. I pressed my hands flat against my lap to stop them from trembling. The pearls at my neck felt heavier than ever. I wanted to scream, to shout that it wasn't a fantasy, that I wasn't a hobby to be joked about. Instead, I sat still, feeling my chest ache, as laughter washed over me like a cruel tide. Lauren beamed at her audience, proud, unbothered. "But we love her anyway," she continued, her voice bright. "Even if she spends more time talking about board meetings than about grandkids, one day she'll realize that some things are better left to the younger generation." Another round of laughter thundered through the hall. Guests clapped, some raising their glasses in mock salute. I caught the glance of a server who quickly looked away, lips pressed tight as if stifling a smile. Inside I was unraveling. Shame burned hot under my skin. The daughter I had carried, raised and celebrated, was standing in front of 200 people and branding me as foolish, delusional, irrelevant. For a fleeting second, my legs twitched under the table. I could leave, slip out, Quietly. Find the exit. Call a cab back to my hotel. I could spare myself from more humiliation. My throat tightened at the thought, tears threatening to break loose. But then I looked up. All eyes were on Lauren, laughter echoing the weight of expectation pressing down. If I left, all anyone would remember was that I couldn't handle the joke. That I ruined my daughter's big night because I was too fragile, too vain. So I stayed. I sat still, nails digging crescents into the fabric of my dress, swallowing the lump in my throat. I forced my lips into a small smile, nodded when someone caught my eye and pretended that my daughter's ridicule was nothing more than a charming anecdote. The applause swelled as Lauren finished passing the microphone back with a graceful bow. She returned to her seat beside Michael, her face flushed with pride. As she leaned into him whispering something that made him laugh again, I realized that in their eyes I wasn't a mother to be honored that night. I was the punchline. I lifted my water glass, the ice clinking softly, and took a sip to steady myself. The laughter was already fading into the background as the next speaker prepared to stand, but the echo of her words lingered inside me, heavy and sharp. I kept my head high, my eyes fixed on the flicker of the chandeliers, determined not to let a single tear fall in that room. When the applause died down and the music started again, I thought maybe the worst was behind me. But humiliation has a way of multiplying in small, quiet moments. A woman in a sequined blue dress leaned over as the servers cleared plates. Her smile was polite, her tone carefully gentle. "Good for you, Margaret. Staying busy at your age keeps the mind sharp." She patted my arm like I was a child who had just managed to tie her shoes. I forced a laugh, murmured thanks, and reached for my glass. Not long after, a man from one of Michael's extended relatives leaned closer, a drink in his hand. "My mother-in-law sells crafts on Etsy," he said jovially. "She made $300 last year. It's nice to have a hobby, isn't it?" His grin was wide, genuine, even as if he thought he was paying me a compliment. The table chuckled some nodding in approval. I smiled faintly, my lips stretched so tight they ached. Inside, though, my chest felt hollow, like something was breaking apart one crack at a time. My business wasn't a hobby. It wasn't trinkets for spare change. But I couldn't tell them that. Not tonight. A younger woman across from me chimed in. "It's wonderful that you're still chasing dreams. It's never too late, even if it's just something small." Her words dripped with condescension, a sweetness that made it sting worse than open mockery. I excused myself, slipping out from the table, weaving through the crowd toward the bar. My heels clicked softly against the floor each step, an effort to keep my composure. The bar was crowded with guests laughing loudly, ordering cocktails, their voices carrying over the music. I was about to ask for a glass of water when I froze. Lauren's voice carried through the din, clear, familiar, impossible to ignore. She was standing near the bar with two of her bridesmaids, her champagne flute in hand, her smile wide. "Poor Mom," she said, shaking her head slightly. "She's just trying to feel important again. It's kind of sad, really." Her friends giggled, one covering her mouth as if to stifle the laugh. "At least she's not calling you every day like some moms do," one of them said. Lauren smirked. "True. I guess it's better she plays entrepreneur than tries dating again. Can you even imagine?" They burst into laughter, sharp and bright, like glass shattering. The words slammed into me like a blow to the chest. Sad. Trying to feel important. Better than dating. My own daughter speaking about me like I was a punchline, a burden to be managed, an embarrassment to be excused. I turned slightly, not wanting them to see me, my hand gripping the bar rail so tightly my knuckles went white. My ears rang with their laughter, the sound wrapping around me, suffocating. My vision blurred as tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. I wanted to vanish, to melt into the marble floor and disappear. The thought of walking back into that room, of sitting through more laughter and polite pity, was unbearable. I closed my eyes, drew a slow breath, and forced myself to stand still until the wave of humiliation ebbed just enough for me to move. My heels clicked again as I turned away, retracing my steps back toward my table. My shoulders squared, my face carefully arranged into that same polite smile. Inside, though, I was unraveling. Each word my daughter had spoken echoed in my mind sharper and sharper until all I could think was how desperately I wanted to leave, to run from the weight of it all. Michael found me near the edge of the dance floor where I had retreated to catch my breath. He slid an arm around my shoulders, in what might have looked affectionate to anyone watching, but his voice carried a different weight. "Margaret," he said quietly, leaning close enough that his breath stirred against my ear. "I know you're trying. I get it. But you don't have to push yourself so hard. At your age, it's healthier to think of these things as hobbies." I stiffened, my body rigid under his touch. A hobby, I repeated, tasting the bitterness of the word. He smiled as though he had offered a kindness. "It's nice, honestly. Everyone needs a pastime. It keeps you busy, and that's what matters, right?" I wanted to scream, to shake him, to tell him that my pastime controlled millions of dollars in assets, that his salary was a footnote compared to the contracts I signed in a single week. Instead, I clenched my jaw, my nails biting into the skin of my palm. A group of Michael's colleagues drifted by at that moment, catching the tail end of his words. One of them, a young man with slicked back hair and a half-empty glass of whiskey, laughed softly. "That's sweet," he said, glancing at me. "My aunt started a little jewelry shop online. Keeps her entertained, too." The others chuckled, nodding their eyes, skating over me with the same patronizing amusement. Their laughter landed like pebbles thrown against glass, small but relentless, threatening to crack something inside me. I smiled faintly, excused myself, and stepped back, every muscle screaming to run, to get out, before the weight of their dismissal crushed me entirely. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him. Richard Anderson. Sterling Systems' chief operating officer moved through the crowd with the ease of a man accustomed to attention. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, his tuxedo perfectly tailored, his champagne glass balanced effortlessly in one hand. He caught Michael's eye first, giving him a courteous nod, then turned his attention to me. "Mrs. Hayes," he said warmly, extending his hand. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. I'm Richard Anderson." I accepted his hand, forcing a polite smile. "Margaret Hayes, nice to meet you." He studied me with a curious expression, the kind of look that said he was trying to place me. "I understand you've done some consulting work. Michael mentioned it." Michael stood beside me, pride puffing his chest as though he had already framed the narrative. "Yes," he cut in, his voice smooth. "She dabbles a bit, helps small businesses here and there. It's been good for her. Keeps her engaged." I felt heat crawl up my throat, but Richard's gaze lingered sharp and thoughtful, not dismissive. "That's admirable," he said. "Starting something new later in life isn't easy. Takes courage." His words weren't mocking, but they carried a polite detachment, the way you'd compliment a child's drawing pinned on a fridge. I nodded, murmuring something non-committal, though inside a storm was building. The irony made my head spin. Here was the COO of a company I owned, though he didn't know it, offering me polite encouragement as if I were dabbling in crafts. The weight of the secret pressed down on me, suffocating and electrifying all at once. Michael chuckled lightly, clapping Richard on the back. "She's been keeping busy. It's cute, really." Richard's brows flickered just for a second, and I wondered if he caught the edge in Michael's tone. He raised his glass to me. "Well, whatever keeps you fulfilled, Margaret, that's what matters." I forced another smile, but my heart pounded, my hands trembling at my sides. Around us, the music swelled as couples took to the dance floor, laughter and clinking glasses blending into a haze. But in that moment, all I could hear was the echo of Michael's voice, hobby pastime cute, and the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears. Richard tilted his head slightly, studying me again, as if sensing there was something he wasn't seeing, some detail that didn't add up. He didn't press, not yet, but his eyes held a glimmer of curiosity. It was the first time that evening I felt the faintest shift in the air, a tremor under the surface of humiliation, a sign that the night was far from over. Richard lingered after his polite toast, studying me as though there were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. His brow furrowed, and when he leaned closer, his voice lowered to something private. "Michael mentioned you do a little consulting work," he said, the corner of his mouth lifting as though it were meant to be encouraging. "Small business type of thing." The words, so casually dismissive, lit something in me I could no longer suppress. My pulse thudded in my ears. I straightened in my chair, met his eyes, and said evenly, "I'm the one who acquired Sterling Systems." For a moment, he didn't move. His smile froze the glass of champagne, trembling slightly in his hand. He nearly lost his grip, steadying it against the edge of the table. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "What did you just say?" I didn't blink. "Hayes Consulting Group. I founded it. I signed the acquisition papers myself." Color drained from his face. His jaw worked, but no words came. That's impossible. Sterling was acquired last year. By me," I said simply. The silence between us was deafening, even in a room buzzing with laughter and music. Richard blinked rapidly, trying to reconcile the woman in a modest navy dress with pearls against the corporate entity that controlled his paycheck. Just then, Evelyn Carter appeared at my side. She had been making her way toward me all evening. Worry etched into her expression each time Amy or Lauren opened their mouths. "Margaret," she said, touching my arm gently. "I was looking for you." Richard turned to her like a drowning man spotting a lifeboat. "Evelyn, tell me I'm not hearing things." Evelyn looked from him to me, then sighed, her shoulders straightening. "She's telling you the truth. Margaret Hayes signed every merger contract, every acquisition agreement. I filed the SEC paperwork myself. Hayes Consulting Group isn't just a consultancy. It's hers. She owns Sterling Systems along with 6 other companies." Richard's mouth fell open. He set his glass down with a thud, rubbing his forehead as if to clear it. "Good God," he muttered. "All this time, we've been—" His eyes darted to the tables where Michael's colleagues sat, still laughing, still making their quiet little jokes. "Do they have any idea?" "None," I said softly. "And I'd prefer it stayed that way. Tonight isn't about me. It's Lauren's wedding." Richard leaned in, his voice sharp with urgency. "Margaret, they mocked you. Your own daughter humiliated you in front of 200 people while half this room draws salaries from companies you own. Do you realize how upside down that is?" Evelyn's eyes softened, but her words were just as firm. "You've let this go on long enough. Hiding your role made sense in boardrooms. But here, with your family, you're letting them erase you." I shook my head, throat tight. "I won't ruin her day." Richard exhaled, his frustration palpable. He lowered his voice again, his tone almost pleading. "People need to know the truth, not for your ego, but because respect is owed to you. This isn't just wrong. It's dangerous. If they treat you this way, what else will they justify?" The words pressed heavy on me. I glanced toward Lauren, her laughter ringing out as she leaned across the head table to whisper to Michael. My chest ached, a mix of pride in her beauty and pain at her cruelty. Richard followed my gaze, his mouth tightening. "I can't believe she let this happen." "She doesn't understand," I said, though the words felt weak, hollow. Evelyn rested a hand on my shoulder. "She won't understand until she's forced to, until you stop shielding her from the truth." The 3 of us stood in a small island of silence while the party swirled around us. Guests raised toasts, servers bustled, laughter ricocheted off the chandeliers. But in that circle, the air was heavy with a secret that could level the entire room. Richard leaned closer once more, his voice low, steady. "They need to hear it. All of them. If you won't tell them, I will." My heart lurched. I whispered, my fingers curling around the edge of the table. "Not tonight. Not like this." But Richard shook his head, determination flashing in his eyes. "This isn't just about tonight. It's about dignity. And you deserve it." Evelyn met my gaze, quiet but resolute. "He's right, Margaret. Sooner or later the truth won't stay buried. The only question is when. I swallowed hard, torn between fear and fury, pride and shame. Around us, the laughter carried on oblivious. Inside me, though, the ground had already begun to shift. Richard's hand tightened on the stem of his glass. His voice dropping to a whisper, meant only for me. Everyone needs to know who you are, and for the first time that evening, I didn't know if I could stop him. Richard's chair scraped against the floor as he stood. His face was pale, his jaw tight, and before I could reach for his arm, he was already moving toward the microphone. The music trailed off awkwardly as he gestured for the DJ to lower the volume. 200 heads turned conversations dissolving into silence as he cleared his throat. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice carrying with a conviction that made the hairs on my arms rise. I owe you all an apology, and especially one person in particular. Mrs. Margaret Hayes. The chatter stopped altogether. Forks froze halfway to mouths. I felt my stomach drop as a spotlight of attention shifted directly onto me. Richard steadied his glass on the podium and continued. We have all been under a serious misapprehension tonight. You've been treating Margaret as if she were dabbling in some hobby. What you don't realize is that she is in fact the founder and owner of Hayes Consulting Group, the firm that has in the last 5 years acquired 7 companies totaling $55 million, including Sterling Systems. Gasps shot through the crowd. Somewhere near the back, a glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered against the floor. The sound of it rang like punctuation to his words. My heart pounded, each beat echoing in my ears. Whispers spread like wildfire, faces turning necks, craning to get a better look at me. I felt exposed, as if the pearls at my neck were shackles instead of ornaments. Lauren's hand gripped the edge of the head table, her knuckles white. "Mom," she stammered, her voice trembling. "Is this true?" I rose slowly, steadying myself against my chair, though my legs wanted to buckle beneath me. I scanned the room. Faces that had been laughing at me moments ago now, wide-eyed mouths hanging open. I met my daughter's gaze and said clear enough for every person to hear, I stayed silent because you asked me not to speak. But I am not delusional. This is the truth. The words landed heavy. The room fell into a silence so thick you could feel the weight of it pressing against your skin. No laughter now. No polite chuckles. Just the collective shock of 200 people realizing the joke had been on them all along. I lowered my eyes briefly, fighting the sting of tears. It wasn't the triumph one might expect. It was a storm of vindication tangled with grief. I hadn't wanted this revelation here, not like this, but the truth was no longer mine to keep hidden. Across the room, Michael's jaw slackened. His face drained of color. His colleagues exchanged frantic glances, some adjusting their ties, others sinking lower in their chairs as though the floor might swallow them. Evelyn stood near the bar, arms crossed, watching with quiet satisfaction, her expression confirming everything Richard had declared. The silence stretched on, unbearable, every breath loud in the cavernous hall. My hands trembled as I folded them before me, forcing myself to stand tall under the weight of every eye in that glittering room. For the first time all evening, no one dared to laugh. The first guest to approach me was the man who had compared my work to his mother-in-law's Etsy shop. His face was flushed red, his tie crooked, and he could barely meet my eyes. "Mrs. Hayes," he stammered, I owe you an apology. I had no idea, truly. If I had known..." His words tangled into themselves, hands fluttering like he was trying to wipe them from the air. I held his gaze steady and cool. "It's all right," I said quietly, though the weight in my chest told me it wasn't. He nodded quickly, retreating like a child who had touched a hot stove. One after another, people came. Smiling too brightly, voices sugary sweet, each apology dripping with the same urgency. "We didn't realize. You've accomplished so much. What an inspiration." Their words clattered against me like coins tossed into a fountain. Shiny, meaningless, hoping for luck. Across the room, Michael stood rigid, his face as pale as the linen on the tables. He smoothed his jacket nervously before stepping toward me, clearing his throat. Miss Hayes, he said, his voice louder than necessary, clearly meant to carry to the ears of his coworkers. I had no idea. It's an honor truly to work under your leadership. The words tasted rehearsed, forced, and yet the sight of my son-in-law scrambling to reposition himself in front of the very colleagues who had joined him in laughing minutes earlier sent a strange flicker of satisfaction through me. He bowed his head slightly as though tipping his hat to a superior, and I thought to myself how quickly respect can be manufactured when jobs and reputations are on the line. Clara, my sister, said nothing at all. She lingered near the dessert table, clutching a glass of wine like a lifeline, her eyes darting anywhere but toward me. For once, she didn't have a sermon, no reminder for me to garden or rest or accept my age. Her silence was its own confession. See. Evelyn moved closer, her presence a steady anchor in the storm of murmurs and shifting gazes. She leaned in, her voice low, meant only for me. You know, Margaret, you have grounds to sue. They mocked you, defamed you, and it was public. If you want, I'll draw the papers myself. I inhaled slowly, the air sharp in my lungs. For a moment, the temptation tugged at me. Revenge, delivered not in whispers but in courtrooms, headline settlements. But then I shook my head. No, I whispered back. I choose silence. That's my strength. Her eyes searched mine, then she nodded understanding. Sometimes silence says more than a lawsuit ever could. And then Lauren was there. My daughter, the bride, her makeup smudged, her hands trembling around the stem of her champagne glass. The room seemed to pause again as she stood before me, her voice breaking. Mom, she whispered, tears spilling over. I'm so sorry, I didn't know. I placed my glass carefully on the table, the weight of it steadying me. My voice was calm but firm. You made a choice, Lauren. You chose to mock me, to stand by while your friends tore me down. You humiliated me in front of everyone. She shook her head desperately, mascara streaking her cheeks. I didn't mean to hurt you. I thought it was harmless, just jokes. Please forgive me. I looked into her eyes, seeing the child she had been, the woman she had become, the stranger she felt like in that moment. My heart ached with love and grief all at once. A simple apology doesn't erase what was said, I told her softly. Words spoken in front of 200 people don't vanish just because you wish them away. Her shoulders shook as she covered her face with her hands. The room around us buzzed with whispers, glasses clinking nervously, but all I could see was my daughter unraveling in front of me and the truth that nothing would ever be the same. The morning after the wedding, the hotel hallways were hushed, littered with wilted flowers and abandoned champagne flutes. I checked out quietly, slipping into a cab headed back to Boston, my reflection in the car window as tired as I felt. My phone buzzed with texts from relatives. Apologies, excuses, desperate attempts to smooth over what could not be smoothed. I turned the screen face down and let the city roll by. In the weeks that followed, I noticed a shift. Michael was the first. He began calling me Miss Hayes at family dinners, his voice tinged with respect that hadn't been there before. He asked questions about business strategies, leaning forward as if my answers carried weight. Once at a brunch, he admitted I honestly had no idea what you'd accomplished. I should have treated you differently. Watching him stumble over his words, I felt a flicker of satisfaction, but also a sadness that respect had to be bought with revelation, not earned through love. Clara. My sister changed in her own way. The same woman who once urged me to stop chasing silly dreams now bragged to her friends. My sister runs a $55 million company, she would say at book club, her voice swelling with pride. When she called, her tone was softer, tinged with awe instead of condescension. I listened polite, but inside I wondered why it had taken public proof for her to believe in me. Lauren, though, was different. My daughter avoided me at first, her shame hanging heavy between us. Then one afternoon she showed up at my office in Boston, her eyes rimmed with tears, asking if we could try therapy together. I hesitated, but agreed. In those sessions, I watched her squirm under the therapist's gentle questions, her voice cracking when she admitted I was embarrassed of my mom. I didn't want people to think she was delusional. The honesty was raw, and for the first time I saw regret carve itself into her face. We made progress slowly. There were sessions where she held my hand, others, where she turned away unable to meet my eyes. Trust, once broken in front of 200 witnesses, is not mended easily. Still, it was a beginning. In the business world, the fallout worked strangely in my favor. Guests from the wedding began reaching out, sheepish but eager. A banker who had laughed at Amy's speech asked if Hayes Consulting Group would advise his firm. A venture capitalist wanted to explore a partnership. Even Richard, once stunned into silence, became one of my most trusted allies. He called me one evening, his voice steady. "Margaret, you handled yourself with more grace than I've ever seen. I'd be honored to keep working with you." Yet in the quiet of my apartment, I often sat by the window looking out at the Boston skyline, replaying the moment Lauren laughed with the crowd. That wound would not vanish with therapy or apologies. It lived in me, sharp and unforgettable. One night over dinner with Evelyn, she lifted her glass of wine and said, "You know, you could have sued, made headlines, taken control in a way no one would forget." I smiled, faintly, shaking my head. "Power isn't always in the noise, Evelyn. Sometimes it's in the silence, letting the truth stand on its own." She nodded, eyes glinting with admiration. And it did. Months passed and the rawness softened. Michael treated me like a mentor. Now Lauren was learning how to be a daughter again, and Clara had found humility. I remained steady, running my company, keeping my secrets where they mattered, and letting the world discover me in its own time. Success, I realized, wasn't about applause or recognition. It wasn't even about the numbers on a balance sheet. It was about standing tall when everyone expected you to bow, about knowing who you are when others try to write you off. As I looked back on that night in Newport, the laughter, the humiliation, the revelation, I understood that silence had been my sharpest weapon. I hadn't raised my voice, I hadn't stormed out, but the truth had found its way into the light regardless. True power, I thought, is when you don't need to prove yourself because reality speaks louder than any defense. And I wonder, to anyone listening now, do you think silence can be the strongest form of revenge? Share your thoughts with me. I want to know.